When we start talking about human impacts on the ocean, I want you to picture how connected your daily life is to these marine systems. Everything from the food we eat to the way our cities are built eventually touches the sea. Nothing we do on land is isolated. The ocean is always receiving, reacting, and adjusting. As we move through, I want you to think about how quickly a healthy marine ecosystem can shift when we add stress to it. The goal today is to not to overwhelm you, but to help you see how understanding these impacts gives us the power to protect these environments. When we look at the habitat modifications, we usually begin right along the shoreline because that is where human changes things the fastest. Most of the time, these changes come from everyday development, new homes, roads, resorts, or ports being built without thinking about long-term consequences. In many countries, especially developing ones, the growth happens so quickly that the planning cannot keep up. Mangroves get cleared, wetlands get filled, and seagrass meadows disappear. Once those habitats are gone, the species that depend on them loses their shelter and food source. It becomes much harder for these ecosystems to bounce back. Coral reefs are one of the clearest examples of what happens when stress builds up from many directions. About a quarter of our reefs are already lost or at serious risk, and about a third of reef-building corals may face extinction. This is a huge number for something that supports so much marine life. What hurts coral the most is the combination of problems. A little pollution here, warmer water there, more sediment washing in from land, plus acidifying water. Then we add destructive fishing and coral collection. Corals are incredibly sensitive, so when they start declining, it is usually the first sign that the entire reef community is in trouble. Trolling shows us how a single fishing method can damage huge areas of habitats when nets are dragged across the seafloor. They also break apart the organisms that live attached to them at the bottom. They also kick up clouds of sediment that settle on animals like sponges or filter feeders and smother them. It is like dragging a heavy rake through the garden again and again. You might collect what you want, but the entire garden gets torn up in the process. This is why trawling is such a concern. It does not just remove fish, it reshapes everything that has living on the bottom. Marine pollution is a big umbrella term, but the core idea is simple. Pollution is anything humans add that lowers the quality of life of the environment. Most of it starts on land, which surprises a lot of people. We are talking about fertilizers, plastics, sewage, industrial chemicals, all of it washing onto the rivers and eventually reaching the ocean. Once these pollutants enter marine waters, they do not stay local. Current spreads them far from the original source. This is why plastic bottles tossed in one city can end up across an entire ocean basin. When we think about pollution, we need to think globally, not just locally. When we talk about the sources of marine pollution, it helps to see how many of them begin on land. Fertilizers wash off farms and fuel harmful algal blooms. Sewage introduces bacteria, nutrients, and chemicals that disrupt coastal ecosystems. Oil enters the ocean not just from large spills, but also from everyday runoff and small leaks. Persistent toxic substances like PCBs and heavy metals stay in the environment for decades and build up in marine food webs. Together, these pollutants create long-term stress in marine habitats and affect everything from plankton to the top predators. When we focus on fertilizers, we are really talking about how our agriculture system spills over into the ocean. Fertilizers wash off fields during rainstorms and flow into rivers and eventually empty into coastal waters. Once these nutrients hit the ocean, they stimulate massive phytoplankton blooms. That might sound good at first, since phytoplankton are producers, but too much growth throws the system off balance. Bottom seaweed starts outcompeting other organisms, and the whole food web shifts. This is a reminder that even something designed to help plants grow on land can cause major problems when it reaches the ocean. Eutrophication is what happens when those excess nutrients fuels an explosion of life that eventually leads to a crash. After the phytoplankton bloom, the cells die and sink to the bottom. Bacteria begin to break them down, and the decomposition uses up the oxygen in the water. When oxygen levels drops too low, we end up with anoxic zones that cannot support most marine life. Fish swim out, invertebrates die, and the bottom becomes a dead zone. On the top of that, the thick surface bloom blocks sunlight, which harms producers below. Sewage pollution is another major issue because it introduces a mixture of biological and chemical stressors. Domestic sewage brings up bacteria and viruses that can cause diseases in marine organisms and in humans who depend on these waters. Industrial sewage may carry heavy metals or toxic chemicals, and those substances can linger in the environment for years. Even treated sewage can contain contaminants that affect marine life. When we think about sewage entering the ocean, we are not just imagining waste. We are imagining a string of pollutants that disrupts water chemistry, food webs, and public health all at once. Oil pollution gets a lot of attention, and for good reasons. Oil sticks to feathers, fur, and delicate tissues, which makes it deadly for many animals. Even when the surface looks clean again, the chemical composition of oil stays in the water and sediment, and organisms absorb them over time. These compounds can interrupt growth, reproduction, and behavior. Habitats like estuaries, mangroves, seagrass beds, and coral reefs are especially vulnerable because oil gets trapped in their structures. Students usually imagine large tanker spills, but everyday runoff, small leaks, and operational discharges adds up to even larger amounts of oil entering the ocean. When we break down the sources of oil pollution, it becomes clear that major spills are only part of the story. Most of the oil reaching the ocean comes from routine activities like runoff from streets, small boat discharge, and leaks from vehicles and machinery. Natural seepage from the seafloor also contributes, although that is not the harmful part. The point I want students to understand is that oil pollution is not rare or occasional, it's continuous. The chronic low-level input creates long-term stress on marine environments, even if we never see a dramatic headline about it, a tanker accident. Persistent toxic substances are the serious concern because they do not break down easily, and once they enter the marine ecosystem, they tend to stay there. Chemicals like chlorinated hydrocarbons and PCBs dissolve into the fats of organisms and move through the food chain. As predators eat contaminated prey, the toxins become more concentrated in their tissues. This process, called biological magnification, means that the top predators like sharks, seabirds, and marine mammals end up carrying the highest levels. When I explain this to students, I remind them that these compounds were created to be long-lasting, so the ocean becomes a storage site for chemicals that never truly disappear. Heavy metals like mercury, lead, cadmium, and copper add another layer of complexity to marine pollution. These substances travel long distances through the atmosphere, and in a process known as global distillation, they accumulate in colder regions where they condense and settle. This is why organisms in the Arctic Ocean show some of the highest levels of contamination, even though they live far from the industrial source. When we discuss this, I want you to see how pollution becomes a global issue. When what is emitted in one country can have an impact on marine life thousands of miles away, especially in regions where ecosystems are already fragile. Beyond chemicals and nutrients, we also have a mix of pollutants that come from everyday human activity. Plastics and microplastics are everywhere, from the surface waters to the deep ocean. And they are now found inside the bodies of many animals. Thermal pollution from power plants raise local water temperatures, which can stress marine organisms. Desalination plants release salty brines that change local salinity. Radioactive waste has entered the ocean from accidents, dumping, and even sunken submarines. When I walk through this, the point to show is that pollution comes in many forms, and each one changes the marine environment in a different way. When we talk about threatened and endangered species in the ocean, we are talking about the populations that have dropped so low that recovery becomes difficult. A threatened species is not in immediate danger, but it is heading towards that direction. An endangered species is one step from disappearing completely. In some cases, human activity drives these species to extinction. Some scientists call these exterminations to highlight that the loss is directly caused by us. This matters because once a species is gone, the relationship it held within the ecosystem disappears too, and the entire community changes. When we look at these numbers, it becomes clear how many marine groups are under serious pressures. Corals alone have more than 200 species listed as threatened, and sharks, rays, and bony fishes each have hundreds of species at risk due to overfishing and habitat loss. All sea turtles fall under CITES protection, and animals like Sirenian sea otters, marine otters, and polar bears are also highlighted because their populations are small and declining. Even whales and dolphins have dozens of species facing threats. Seeing these categories side by side shows us that human impacts are widespread and that many marine animals are closer to extinction than most people realized. Examples of threatened and endangered marine species helps us connect these ideas to real organisms. Whales and sharks have been pushed to low numbers through overfishing. Sea turtles are harvested for food and shells, and they also lose nesting habitats along developed coastlines. Many coral species struggle due to warmer waters, acidification, and collections for the aquariums to trade. Giant clams and other shells are removed faster than they can actually reproduce. When we hear these examples, I want you to see that each species is part of a larger story. The pressures they face reflect on the pressures on the ecosystems they actually belong to. When we shift into conservation efforts, I want you to see that the situation is not hopeless. Around the world, we are seeing coordinated attempts to protect marine ecosystems at local, national, and international levels. Coastal development is being managed more carefully to prevent habitat loss. Fisheries management has improved, especially within exclusive economic zones where countries have the power to regulate their own waters. Marine protected areas and reserves also give species the space they need to recover. Habitat restoration and artificial reefs bring damaged areas back to life. These are powerful examples of what can happen when science guides policy and communities work together.